A reading from the letter of St. James. Beloved, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every foul practice. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure, then peaceable, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, without inconstancy or insincerity. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace. Where do the wars and where do the conflicts among you come from? Is it not from your passions that make war within your members? You covet, but do not possess. You kill and envy, but you cannot obtain. You fight and wage war. You do not possess because you do not ask. You ask, but do not receive, because you ask wrongly, to spend it on your passions. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Where do the wars and where do the conflicts among you come from? Is it not from your passions that make war within your members? There is something you see in many of the church's saints that I think strikes us as puzzling, at least it strikes me as somewhat puzzling. And that's that in these holy men and women, they're the first to admit their own sinfulness, even their great sinfulness. Right? I think of Catherine of Siena, who says that the problems of Europe, the problems of the church in her time, are the result of her own sins. I think of Ignatius of Antioch, right, as he's going off to martyrdom, writes to the Romans that I have just now begun to be a Christian. This man who was a bishop, a leader to so many, saying he's just now begun to follow Christ. Even in the scriptures themselves, right, we find St. Paul writing to Timothy, saying that he, Paul, is the greatest of all sinners. Not just that he was, he is the greatest of sinners. How are we supposed to take statements like this? These men and women who I think we can see are manifestly holy, declaring their own sinfulness. I think sometimes we kind of brush it off as pious mutterings, right? It's just their excessive humility that leads them to say this, and they're exaggerating. We shouldn't take it all that seriously. But I think maybe there's something more to statements like these. Right? The saints are the ones who know God. They're the ones who are familiar with the Lord, familiar with his ways, who know him so well. And in knowing God, they know themselves. Right? We think of, again, Catherine of Siena, to whom God says, I am he who is, you are she who is not. In knowing God, Catherine comes to know herself. In knowing God, then, these saints come to recognize his goodness more and more clearly. They see that God is the one who is good. Not them, but God. And they see the ways that they fall short of God in even starker contrast. Any decision that they make to turn from God, to turn away from his ways, to turn away from his goodness, is so clearly wrong, so clearly an injustice, so clearly ugly, that any sin they see in its utter, stark rejection of God. So when they see these sins in themselves, even though they might seem small, they might seem like little sins, these saints see them for what they really are, which is a turning away from God's goodness. And they react in the strongest way we can, right, when we recognize the distance between God's goodness and even our smallest of sins. Where do the wars and where do the conflicts among you come from? Is it not from your passions that make war within your members? If this disorder, this falling short of God's goodness is present in these saints that we rightly look up to, that we rightly venerate as models of the Christian life, how much more is that same disorder in us? Right? That's what it means to be fallen, that ordering of their nature that our first parents experienced in the garden was lost in sin. All of us experience this disorder, this inner turmoil that leads us in so many directions. We're pulled by our passions, by our desires, by all the things that seem good to us, try to pull us in all different directions and lead us into this division. The inner division comes outward. And it's true, I think for most of us, right, this manifests in what we might think of as, right, little sins. Harsh words, impatience with someone, a mental judgment. It's not murder, it's not theft. It's just a little turning away from the Lord, a little more disorder in our lives coming out into the world. But because those are just little things, I think it's tempting to try to brush them aside, to diminish them even more. It's not so bad. I'm not murdering, right? I was hungry. I was tired. I was distracted. The other person made me do it. If he hadn't been acting in that way, I would never have responded like I did. But right, as these saints show us, even those little sins point out this profound weakness that we experience within ourselves. We, in ourselves, can't calm those storms that we experience. We can't overcome the disorders, the troubles that lead to the conflicts in which we find ourselves. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we're capable of even greater evil. Right? I think most of us are, when we look at ourselves, we realize we're capable of greater evil than we usually care to admit. And we know that we can't overcome it on our own. And that's why St. James tells us today that there is a wisdom from above. A wisdom from above that is pure, peaceable, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, without inconstancy or insincerity. A wisdom from above that can come and bring order to our lives where there is disorder. And that wisdom has come down from above. That wisdom has dwelt among us. Christ, the wisdom of God, the power of God, the Word through whom all things were made, became man. He dwelt among us. He taught us his ways. And in the fullness of time, he took on all of our sins. He took on all of our disorders on the cross to reconcile us, to set us right to God. And this Christ, this wisdom from above, Jesus, is living now to work in our lives. He wants to set us aright. He gives us to share in his kingdom even now as we hope for the fullness of that kingdom to come. And what it takes is to join him in that dying to sin so that we can hope to rise to life with him. Right? We can't overcome our own sinfulness, our own disorders. We need Jesus to come into our lives. We need to plead for this wisdom from above to come and help us to be set aright, knowing that this wisdom is always a gift from God. Again, this is what we see in those saints. Those same saints who could recognize their own sinfulness, their own disorder, were the same ones who could rejoice in the mercy that was shown them, who could rejoice that God, in his love, had looked on them, had given his Son to them, had called them into a relationship with himself, and who in turn could give themselves completely to God. They were loved by God. They knew they were loved by God. And they knew that that love overcame any evil, any sin that they saw in their own lives. They opened themselves to God and allowed their whole lives to be ordered by the sweet, pure, peaceful wisdom from above. The most credible witness that any Christian can give.
Virgo Maria.